Okay, here's a one-on question for you. Did a single doctored clip where the two sentences they spliced together were actually delivered, get this, 54 minutes apart, did that just cause the biggest media leadership crisis in, like, a decade?
It sounds almost unbelievable, but yeah, that's exactly what seems to have happened. We are diving deep today into this absolute firestorm around the BBC, the world's oldest public broadcaster.
The fallout is just staggering, isn't it? It goes way beyond, a simple editing mistake. We're talking about the top two executives resigning at the same time.
You have the Director General, Tim Davie, and the CEO of BBC News, Deborah Turness, both gone. And it all traces back to this revelation that a documentary, an investigative one no less, intentionally manipulated footage of President Donald Trump's January 6th speech.
Right, and we've got our hands on the internal memos, the whistleblower details, and the outside analysis that lays out how this whole thing exploded. So our mission today is to unpack what this one, let's be frank, pretty major editorial failure tells us about bigger things.
Bigger things like alleged institutional bias, yeah, and the internal political battles this seems to have ignited.
Exactly. And also these huge billion-dollar legal threats that are now seriously shaking the credibility, maybe even the financial stability, of public news outfits everywhere. It really drills down into trust, doesn't it? And this feels like a catastrophic breach.
Okay, so to really grasp the scale here, you have to look at the edit itself. What actually happened? The controversy is centered on this 2024 documentary, Panorama, Trump, A Second Chance.
And it aired at a really sensitive time, right? Just before the 2024 presidential election.
Precisely. And the analysis we've looked at suggests this wasn't just some minor tweak. It looks like it was deliberately edited to, completely change what the speech meant.
How so? They took two different lines.
Yeah, two lines delivered almost an hour apart and just smashed them together. The effect was to paint this picture of Trump directly inciting violence.
So what did the doctored version sound like?
It basically made it sound like Trump said, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like age." You hear that, and it sounds like an immediate command, right? Go fight. Now.
It absolutely does. But the crucial part, the thing that just blows this whole thing open, is that 54-minute gap.
54 minutes.
Yeah.
Nearly an hour between those two thoughts. But, it gets worse. It's also about what they left out.
What did they leave out?
This is key. The BBC later admitted they cut the part earlier in the speech, where Trump specifically told supporters they should march to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Wow. Okay, so they removed the peacefully and patriotically bit and then jammed in the fight like hell bit from almost an hour later, making it sound like one single aggressive order to get violent right then and there. That seems to go way beyond an error of judgment.
That's certainly how the whistleblower framed it. This was Michael Prescott, a former independent advisor. He argued the edit materially misled viewers. Full stop.
And the BBC's reaction.
Well, eventually they did apologize for the error of judgment. They conceded the edit gave the impression of a direct call for violent action. But, by then the damage was done. Apologies weren't enough to save the top jobs.
Clearly not. The fallout was immediate. Davie and Turness resigned that Sunday. They used the standard language, taking ultimate responsibility.
Right. But even as she resigned, Turness pushed back, didn't she? She insisted BBC News is not institutionally biased.
Yeah, which is a tough claim to make stick when you look at what was apparently in that leaked memo from Prescott. His dossier wasn't just about this one Trump edit, was it?
No, not at all. It alleged systemic bias. Across a whole range of contentious issues.
Like what else was he pointing to? Because these internal fights, they're usually about more than one incident.
Definitely. So beyond the political coverage of Trump, he apparently raised deep concerns about how the BBC handled topics like its own racial diversity policies. Also, coverage of biological sex versus gender identity. He apparently cited specific examples where he felt the LGBTQ desk wouldn't touch difficult questions around the trans debate. And significantly, he alleged what he saw as clear anti-Israel bias, even calling some Gaza coverage by BBC Arabic pro-Hamas. So it paints a picture of a potential pattern, not just one bad edit.
And of course, this stuff gets weaponized instantly in the political arena. President Trump jumped right on it.
Oh, immediately. He publicly thanked the group that broke the story and called the BBC very dishonest people who tried to step on the scales of a presidential election.
So the stakes went from editorial standards to election interference accusations like that.
And then came the legal threat. Trump threatened a huge lawsuit, $1 billion. for defamation, unless the BBC issued a full apology and retraction by a Friday deadline.
Hold on, $1 billion with
Yeah.
a B.
Yeah.
That completely changed the game, doesn't it? This isn't just about accountability anymore. That's an existential threat to a publicly funded body. They're fighting for their reputation and their finances over one edit.
Exactly right. And that immense pressure from the whistleblower memo, the political attacks, the billion-dollar lawsuit threat, that's why some insiders of the BBC apparently describe the resignations differently.
How so?
They didn't just see it as executives taking responsibility. They saw it as an internal coup, like a political campaign, maybe by rivals within the BBC, who use these mistakes as leverage to force out the leadership.
That makes a certain kind of political sense. You find a mistake, and you use it as a weapon. But okay, this brings us to the deeper issue, right? The one Prescott's memo and other analyses seem to point towards this impartiality paradox. Why does an organization that talks so much about due impartiality keep getting tangled up in these bias rows?
Well, one really fascinating detail we found in the analysis is how the BBC seems to apply its own rules differently, depending on who they're covering.
Differently how?
The analysis suggests BBC journalists felt, well, more emboldened. That's the term used to really scrutinize and even directly contradict foreign politicians like Trump much more aggressively than they did their own UK politicians.
Can you give us the numbers on that? Because that sounds like a textbook double standard.
The numbers are pretty stark. Okay, so when BBC journalists were covering U.S. politicians, say Trump or Biden, the journalists themselves stepped in with direct corrections. They call them corrective interactions, or CIs, in about 51% to 52% of cases, over half the time.
So the journalist would basically say, no, that's wrong.
Yeah, sometimes explicitly, using phrases like verdict, that's not right, directly to the politician or about their claims. And for Trump specifically, claims he made, he gave this direct, explicit correction from the journalist a staggering 71% of the time.
71%. Okay, so rule number one. If you're a foreign leader, especially Trump, the BBC journalist is the referee, calling foul constantly.
That seems to be the pattern for outsiders. Now flip it. Look at how they covered their own leaders in the UK, like former Prime Ministers Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn.
Okay, what were their number?
Much, much lower. Journalists issued those direct CIs only 27% of the time for Johnson and just 21% for Corbyn.
21% versus 71. That is a massive difference. So what did they do instead of directly correcting their own leaders?
They tended to fall back on the more traditional, maybe safer he said, she said reporting. So instead of the journalist saying, that's wrong, they'd have another politician challenge the claim. It's a much more passive way of handling disputed facts.
It really shows that impartiality isn't some fixed rule, is it? It's flexible. Applied hard to outsiders, soft to insiders.
Highly elastic, yeah.
Yeah.
Applied very differently depending on who's speaking.
And this, for you listening, this is where we need to connect the dots. This apparent failure of impartiality, this pattern of treating political figures differently, it feeds directly into that broader worry that maybe crucial information, especially on big policy debates, is getting skewed or even hidden by a kind of mainstream consensus.
Exactly. When people see a major news source seemingly shaping a narrative about one political figure, it makes them wonder, maybe rightly, okay, what else are they not telling me straight? Especially when it comes to things like, say, climate and energy policy, where the narratives can be very strong.
Right. That erosion of trust from something like the doctored Trump clip makes people more likely to believe that maybe the mainstream story on other big topics isn't reliable either, especially when that story seems to clash with, basic economics or physics.
And speaking of reality checks, the analysis we looked at from McKinsey & Company's Global Energy Perspective for 2025, it offers a really stark contrast to some of the more common media narratives about energy.
How so? What did McKinsey find?
Well, it's a major reversal. Just last year, McKinsey was forecasting, like many others, a big shift to green energy. They predicted a 40% drop in global coal demand by 2035. That was the dominant story.
Okay, a 40% drop in coal, but what's the new report say?
The opposite, basically. It's shocking. They've completely reversed that. McKinsey now projects a 1% increase in coal demand over that same period to 2035.
An increase, not a drop.
An increase. They're essentially admitting the transition away from fossil fuels isn't going to be nearly as fast or simple as previously thought. They project that coal, oil, and natural gas will still provide up to 55% of global energy way out in 2050.
55% in 2050. That's only down about 9 points from today's 64%. That totally challenges the idea that fossil fuels are almost dead and renewables will just seamlessly take over soon.
Yeah, the timeline is much, much longer, according to this data, and the report really highlights the potential costs, the economic pain of trying to rush that transition too fast.
What kind of cost?
They argue that heavily relying on intermittent sources like wind and solar, without enough backup, can be, quote, economy killers, making electricity grids expensive and unstable. And this is happening just as electricity demand is set to surge.
Surge how much?
They estimate global electricity demand will go up 17% annually between 2022 and 2030, driven hugely by just one thing: data centers, powering AI and the cloud.
17% a year. Wow. And you just can't reliably power that kind of massive growth with sources that only work when the sun shines or the wind blows, can you?
That's the core problem. And this brings us to that German example you mentioned earlier, the Dunkelflaut. We should explain that.
Yeah, what is Dunkelflaut? It sounds ominous.
It literally translates to dark doldrums. It's basically the nightmare scenario for a grid that relies heavily on renewables. It means a long period where it's very cold, so demand is high, but there's also very little sun and very little wind.
So both solar and wind power just crater at the same time.
Exactly. An energy drought when you need power the most. And the McKinsey report looked at a real Dunkelflaut event in Germany in November 2024. Germany, remember, has invested massively in renewables.
And what happened?
During that crisis, conventional fossil fuels, coal, and natural gas power plants had to be fired up to provide 70% of Germany's electricity. 70%, just to keep the lights on and people warm.
70% backup from fossil fuels. That's a stunning number. It feels like proof that whatever the preferred narrative is, that the physics and economics mean we're going to rely on conventional fuels for a long, long time, especially when things get tough.
It certainly lends weight to the critique that some policy goals are being promoted without fully acknowledging the real-world constraints, doesn't it?
It really does. So you see this collision. On one hand, a perceived failure of media impartiality, like the BBC bias allegations, and on the other hand, data like McKinsey's that challenges prevailing policy narratives. One seems to reinforce skepticism about the other.
That's a good way to put it. A collision.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We started with a single, really misleading edit. 2 sentences spliced together from 54 minutes apart. That edit didn't just force 2 top executives out and spark a billion-dollar lawsuit against the BBC.
Right. It also sort of ripped the lid off this deeper issue, this apparent double standard in how a major news organization applies its own impartiality rules.
The key takeaway, it seems, is how that failure in journalism principle, the idea that you treat everyone the same, created an opening. Journalists felt okay aggressively fact-checking foreign leaders.
But used a much lighter touch, that old he said, she said, for their domestic politicians. And that selective approach, that very visible difference, is exactly what fueled the political attacks that brought down the leadership.
And then connecting it more broadly, that damage to media trust makes people more skeptical of mainstream narratives in general, especially when hard data, like the McKinsey report showing coal demand rising and fossil fuels sticking around until 2050, seems to tell a very different story than the one often presented.
It all feeds together. The BBC crisis demonstrates that accusations of bias aren't just PR problems anymore. They can lead to internal upheavals, massive legal costs.
Which leaves us with a really tough question for you, the listener, to think about. If public trust is absolutely essential for a free press, but every single editorial mistake, especially confirmed ones like this BBC edit, gets seized on by political actors to attack that trust, how do news organizations navigate this? How do they balance the vital need for robust, fearless fact-checking, calling out falsehoods, challenging powerful figures, with the very real existential threat of becoming just another pawn in a polarized political war?